Man, this whole episode is versus audience. We are mementoing our own podcast.
Hi, I'm Chaz Fisher.
And I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where two Aussie filmmakers try to work out what makes great screenplays work.
And in today's episode, the very final part of our epic, tiring, exhaustive, and exhausting look at sources of antagonism, we are talking about films that are versus audience. To recap, for those who, for some reason, weren't listening to the previous four parts, which you should probably listen to before we talk about this one, we talked about films that their central conflict was versus human, human versus self, human versus nature, and human versus systems. And when we originally talked about this fifth mysterious episode that somehow we would possibly reach this promised land of part 5, we were originally calling it versus other, as in we wanted to look at films that didn't seem to have a central source of antagonism. But what we realized in this homework is, for at least these kinds of films, and we'll go into more detail in a bit about this specific thesis, because I don't think there still are other films, but they're so out of the ballpark of narrative, like Stan Brakhage, that there's no point, really, a screenwriting podcast talking about Stan Brakhage, because it's video art, basically.
Yeah. Well, let's say what the films that we're looking at, because I think some of these are arguably video art as well.
You need to watch more video art, man.
No, I don't.
So tell me, Chaz, what are these films that we are looking at?
All right, so we're looking at this year's Ocean's 8, F for Fake, Soleil, this year's The Second, which is an Australian release, and we'll talk more about that later, particularly whether overseas viewers can watch it or not. And we're finishing off strong with Forrest Gump.
Finishing off with the manga wet dream of Forrest Gump. I think that's what you wanted me to say. Liberals are bad, okay? That's that film. And we want to thank our patrons for making this episode of Draft Zero possible. They help us to have more Draft Zero more often. But in the case of this episode, they also voted on the films that we're going to look at. And Forrest Gump itself was a suggestion of one of our patrons, Jules. And people voted it, and when we looked at it, it really nailed the thesis. So thanks to Jules for the suggestion. So if you also want to have more Draft Zero more often, or have a say, or the illusion of a say, the delusion of a say, please feel free to follow the links to our Patreon in our show notes. And now we can begin.
God, we've for the first time ever, we've got a timer running, and I think it's just going to end up scaring me to look at. I'll start developing a twitch. So, you have here that you'd like to actually start with your learnings, or our learnings, I suppose, if we do it one after another, from the series thus far, and hopefully lead to some kind of theses that we can take into these films.
Yes. And this will also tie into what do we mean by versus audience. Having listened to our key learnings over all the previous 4 episodes, we kind of came to the conclusion by the end of part 4 that the antagonistic forces, I'm going to talk about that word itself soon, that that these forces of conflict, forces of whatever you want to call them, that these forces pressure the protagonist to make decisions, to make a final decision. And I want to take that a step further, and I think there's 2 ways you can look at the question, which is that these sources of antagonism all stem from a kind of a pattern of conflict, and that's what we mean by human versus human, or human versus self. It's like that is the source of the conflict, and that leads them to make their final choice. Or I think there's the flip side of that, which is the sources of pressure lead the character to make a choice about the central source of conflict. So in the case of shame, his choices are ultimately about himself. That the sources of pressure, which includes his sister, are actually about him. coming to and dealing with his sex addiction. Whereas in Systems, which we talked about, the choices that ultimately the characters are pressured into are either succumbing to the system, escaping the system, destroying the system, or overthrowing it, which is the same kind of thing. And so I think that's kind of the structure of all these films. What I think is interesting about all these films that we're talking about is the central source of conflict is, well, between the film and the audience, and that there are pressures within the film that make the audience make choices or at least ask questions in a way that I don't think these other films do. That's actually kind of my central thesis, because I think that idea of pressuring the character to make choices is true whether you're talking about something kind of scene level, a sequence level, an act level, or over the whole film.
While I've been, editing a lot of these episodes, I've been compiling my list of questions that I want to apply to my own work as I go, so using them as craft tools. So I'll quickly throw those out there, and then we can leap into Matt's question. So, I think your summary is perfect. I think it summarizes all my points. My questions of my own work are more about delving into that. So right at the very beginning, I kind of started in with the want versus need that drew one of our patrons' comment/criticism earlier. But I do think there's a difference between if your protagonist has stated goals and obstacles that are in between the character and those goals. So I think those are very clearly plot antagonists, and they're getting in the way of what the protagonist wants. Now, for all the issues with want versus need, I think there's definitely a difference between a want that the character is aware of and a want or a need that the character doesn't know that they, want or need, certainly, or at the beginning of the story.
As we talked about, the need is something that the writer is imposing on the character rather than the character himself being self-aware of.
And then I've got the question, how do the antagonistic forces pressure the character to change? And those are often, as you've used the word, like enablers or pullers. They're not necessarily obstacles, and they're not in the way of a goal. They're, as you say, they're forcing change on the character because that's what the writer wants to take the character. I've got what pressures are negatively or positively forcing your character to make choices that they would not otherwise have made. And I think that's really kind of how I came to the realization, I can't even remember which episode it's in, but it's gotten stronger with each episode that we've done, that really what I now look at the protagonist and the protagonist's journey as this kind of, bit of rock. And it's the antagonistic forces that chip away at the rock and reveal it. It's not that the protagonist is going around doing things. It's the sources of antagonism that are sculpting the protagonist, sculpting the choices, sculpting the journey and the plot. I've got the question, how do your antagonistic forces mirror your protagonist's wants or needs? And my clearest example of that was the choice of the wolves from The Grey. What is at stake if your protagonist fails? I mean, these are some obvious 101 screenwriting questions, but you and I feel like we've revisited these screenwriting basics and tenets through this idea of antagonism, because the stakes are pressure. The stakes are, driving the decision. What decision do you want your protagonist to make at the end of the film, and how have the antagonistic forces pressured the antagonist to get to this point from the beginning of the film? I mean, when we did Systems, I still marvel at how the lobster took a character to a point where it makes perfect sense that at the end of the movie, he's standing in a bathroom considering cutting his eyes out with a steak knife. And it makes perfect sense because the forces of antagonism have built it that way. I've got the question, are your antagonistic forces sentient? Can they be bargained with? Do they have wants or needs that can be met? What tactics does your protagonist use or learn or attempt in order to overcome the antagonistic forces? What tactics are completely unavailable to your protagonist because of the antagonistic forces being sentient or non-sentient? And a kind of extension of that is, how defeatable are your antagonistic forces? Is your protagonist even aware of them in the same way that the characters in Mudbound aren't aware of racism or white supremacy as a system? They're not making their decisions in relation to furthering white supremacy or trying to overthrow it.
It's not a conscious conspiracy, except in many cases it was.
Yes, within that story, but it wasn't part of the character's consciousness, if that makes sense. Is your protagonist trying to overthrow them, enforce them, or just abide by them? Does your protagonist ever hope to defeat the antagonistic forces, or does she just want to survive them, or give up, as was the case with our man in All Is Lost?
I think you should take these notes and send them out to our patrons in their news.
All right. Which only costs them $1 an episode.
God, it feels like we're actually demonstrating versus audience antagonism right now. Because there's a few observations I want to make about what you're saying. I think that's a great summary overall. But I think there's a few things, because it's how does this relate to our specific topic now of films that there is a conflict between the film and the audience. And I think there's two things, which is you talked about, which is pressure. And I realized that we never specifically talked about the idea that time itself is a form of pressure on characters. We often talk about ticking clocks, and really the ticking clock is about increasing the pressure on characters. And we know that's in many ways that's what game shows are about. You put them under a ticking clock to make people make choices. We do it to ourselves. 30 seconds and we go, you can decide what you eat, whereas if we give ourselves all day to decide what we eat, then we will often make, take our time.
Better choices.
Yeah, which is often, why people like me often do their writing really late at night and finish at, 3 a.m. because it pressures me to make some decisions of the things I've been ruminating on all day. So I just wanted to talk about the time thing because I'll come and talk about that in terms of context of the form. Yeah. And also the sentience, which is that while films themselves aren't sentient, they're created by people who are, hopefully, maybe, until we have films written by computers. And so in a way, you're engaging with something that's that is architected, which is like, what we talked about in terms of the versus systems. But I'm going to transition inelegantly to what Matt's feedback. And for those who don't know, Matt is my co-writer and he isn't a patron of this podcast, which really annoys the shit out of me. And so I'm just saying it to publicly shame him. Because he gets way too much airtime as it is in terms of airing his grievances. So he made two observations. One, which is, what makes you think antagonism is about making characters change? And I thought about it, and I'm like, well, that's actually the whole point. That's what an obstacle does. A character has a goal, and if there was no obstacle in the way, they're just going to take their goal. They don't have to change. They don't have to make any choices. Even if the change is, I'm going to step around this rock that is in my path from continue on the path. That is actually forcing them to change on a little level. And we talked about a lot about in the tactics, about really minute changes. But I think ultimately that's what obstacles are. They're forcing the characters to change. Like it's actually inevitable. And I think a good example of that, which I've actually recently cited somewhere else, and I love my Star Wars examples, is and this kind of relates to the whole sequence structure thing, is the first kind of act of Star Wars is the pressure on Luke that forces him to make the choice to go off with Obi-Wan. We've talked about the hero's choice at the end, these binary choices, but films are full of choices and decisions for the characters. And all the pressure leads to, including like the killing of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru and Obi-Wan and all that stuff, leads to Luke agreeing to go off on a crazy adventure with Obi-Wan, right? So that is kind of orchestrated to make him that choice. So I think those kinds of decisions are active throughout the film. Yeah. Matt's broader issue was with our use of the word antagonist. He thought it was too imprecise. And for the kind of he said what we were doing, which I like, was the taxonomy of conflict. But I think he suggested that describing something as having an active hostility was a really useful way of thinking about it. And I agree. And this relates specifically to this episode, which is there are things that are kind of, okay, I can sit down and watch a foreign language film without subtitles. And the film is impenetrable to me because I don't speak any languages other than English. And I don't even do that very well, clearly. So the film is impenetrable to me, but it's not doing it in an active way. Whereas, to use an extreme, like a lot of avant-garde cinema or even like David Lynch's stuff can be designed in such a way to be actively hostile to the audience understanding it. and this comes to my time thing, because I actually say there are two fundamentals to a movie, which is one, time. Film unfolds over time, and I think there is video art that exists on loops and stuff like that, and that's where it's getting outside of the boundaries of what we're talking about, whether it's a 10-hour series or a 50-hour 5-season show or a 1-hour or 5-minute short. It's time-based. And two, the goal then is to get to the end of the film, the character goal. And so films that are ideally having a meaningful experience, so films that actively challenge the unfolding of the narrative in such a way that you can get to the end of the film knowing what it means, are kind of actively hostile to the audience. If you get a film where people are like, I don't get it, like Memento, that film is actively hostile to the audience. And I think all these films that we're talking about now are going to be actively hostile in various degrees to the audience, not just have active hostility between characters or between themselves.
What I appreciate about what you're doing here is tying it back to the films and laying some good groundwork for us talking about how we think these films are, quote unquote, versus audience. But I just want to, I completely agree with Matt's point of view that we're doing a taxonomy of conflict. And, I'm happy to take his point that maybe our use of antagonist or antagonistic forces doesn't work for him. But I do think it's useful for me as a writer, and then also in any kind of development context, where there's a scene in Shame, or it's a sequence that we talked about. It was one of my favorite sequences in the film, where he's trying to develop an intimate personal relationship with a coworker, and he takes her to a hotel room. He's a sex addict. She wants to have sex with him. He is getting everything that he wants. They are developing a personal, intimate relationship, and yet his obstacle, his addiction, his fear of intimacy, whatever it is, himself, gets in the way of it. There was no obstacle there. There was only a person trying to reach him and go along with him. And I mean, we kind of posit the view that the obstacle was himself. But to me, if I'm ever in a development meeting or even with myself, I can go, well, this scene does have an antagonist. It does have a source of conflict. She is an antagonist in that she is, representing everything he needs and can't have. And to me, it works for me to use the term antagonist in outside of just a villain or an obstacle.
Yeah, I think people confuse, which we've talked about, antagonist with villain. And self-included once upon a time. They use the words interchangeably and then often not the same. I think the other reason to defend our use of it is that and I really like the phrase active hostility. I actually think that's a really good term of reference. Is this actively hostile? Maybe it needs to be more active in its, or maybe it needs to be more hostile in terms of what it's doing. But I think the idea is that just because of the nature of the way we speak about script, antagonism or an antagonist implies a relationship with the protagonist. And often what we are talking about, as we talked about, we're talking about the relationship between the protagonists and a source of conflict. We're talking about the relationship between John Anderton and pre-crime. We're talking about the relationship between Brandon and his sex addiction. We're talking about the relationship between John McClane and Hans Gruber. It implies a relationship, and therefore I think it is, in this case, we're actually saying that there is a relationship, a more complex relationship between the audience and the film itself, and that is active and intentional conflict between the audience and the film itself in all of these films. It falls on a spectrum, which is why we're starting with Ocean's 8, because I don't think it's deliberately trying to alienate you. Yeah. And we're ending with Forrest Gump because I don't think Forrest Gump's trying to alienate you either. But in the middle, kind of F for Fate, and Soleil, and even in the second, all to various degrees are trying to are a little bit prickly towards the audience, and because what we've been talking about, antagonists can be sequence based or act based, that you might want a film that is Sans Soleil or F is Fate. And I'm kind of giving our learnings at the beginning, but I think it's worth saying because I know we had a listener, Paul. He was like, "Oh, this sounds a little bit art house shit." He didn't say shit, but art house wank for me. I want to write comedies, and the answer is like, well, yeah, you don't have to do a whole film like one of those, but you could do a sequence like it. You could do a scene like it, that you can take one of those ideas and go, wouldn't it be interesting if the film at this moment, the film is actually, to make the film interesting at this point, we actually play it in a particular way. And as we'll talk about in Ocean's 8, the easiest way is to put the audience in a position where we're behind the characters. We know less than the film. The film is deliberately withholding information, and coming back to my thesis that the goal is to finish a film feeling like it's a worthwhile experience. If you don't understand what's happened at the end, then you feel, so you want to know, you want to pick up the clues and feel like you've gone on a journey. So this is me trying to transition into Ocean's 8. I mean, I've looked at the clock now and it's 55 minutes, so we've obviously had a really long introduction.
In 3.5 weeks, the Met will be hosting its annual ball, and we are going to rob it. Not the ball itself.
On the neck of Daphne Kluger.
Valued at over $100 million.
150 million, actually.
Revenge. It's a twofer.
Do not run a job in a job.
Taylor Swift? Can't we just go to this? Do we have to steal stuff?
Yes.
What I like about this topic is that we didn't, as you said at the very beginning, Stu, we didn't come into this looking for versus audience films. We deliberately set out to pick films that were less narrative based because we wanted to see how conflicts or antagonistic forces worked within, less narrative based films, see if we could learn anything to then take back to our own writing. And it was only after watching F for Fake and Sans Soleil that I think you and I both got the firm idea that if you take out all sources of narrative conflict, then you don't necessarily have narrative on a grander scale. What is left to keep you engaged? And it was clearly then, as you said, developing a relationship between the film and the audience. Now, Ocean's 8 is clearly not in the same leagues of doing this in terms of Sans Soleil and F for Fake, but I think it made some really interesting decisions from a narrative structure point of view and from a character point of view that are unusual. And I think they fit this mold because they let the audience... The enjoyment from the film, what compels you to keep watching the film is the audience's relationship with the film less than with what's going to happen next, which might be plot driven, or what's going to happen to those characters, out of concern, or where are they going to end up. Is that fair?
Yes. I mean, I think on one level, genre implies a relationship. Part of, thwarting expectations of genre is the film itself understanding how you process its structure, or giving into it. And I think Ocean's 8 being a heist film is absolutely about that. There is a long history of heist films and what ways they do and don't thwart our expectations of the genre, which is kind of like on a macro level. So before we go into it too far, we should probably summarize what Ocean's 8 is. Ocean's 8 is kind of a spiritual sequel to obviously the Oceans, not obviously, may or may not be obvious, is a spiritual sequel to the Oceans film, but it's a all female ensemble cast. And it follows Debbie Ocean, who's the younger sister of the apparently late Danny Ocean, who was the George Clooney character in the other films, and her former partner in crime, Lou, and their plan is to steal some jewelry from the Met Gala. That's it. And that's kind of more or less their goal. It's stated very early on. This is going to be this great crime, and they're going to be putting together a crack team, an A-team, of people to go and steal this diamond. That's the goal that we're told at the beginning. Yep. And there's not much interpersonal conflict between any of the characters. They kind of all get on. And in terms of the villain, and so there, but what we're missing is, like, unlike the Oceans film, and you recently rewatched Oceans 11, there's no big kind of quote unquote antagonist. There's no villain. because there's no casino. The closest is they have to steal the necklace from Daphne, who's played by, what's her name? Anne Hathaway. And he's not even really a villain, but he is a personal villain for Debbie, which is her ex, Claude, Becca, an art dealer, who will learn very quickly, ratted her out to the police when he was discovered for art fraud. He basically framed her as doing all the fraud on his behalf.
I think like you said, there's a clear goal, right? There's a clear plot and...
Clear goal that we're told about.
Yeah, and the heist sequence is very densely micro-plotted. But I think the big difference between... As you said, I just rewatched Ocean's 11 and I was wanting to find out how similar or different was this to Ocean's 11. In Ocean's 11, I think there's actually less of a villain than there is in Ocean's 8 because Andy Garcia is only actually really introduced halfway through the film and he doesn't do anything particularly villainous. We hear he does villainous things, but we don't see it. The main the reason he's an antagonist is because Julia Roberts' character, Danny's ex-wife, Tess, wants to be with him, right? So he's less of a personal villain than, I can't even remember his name, but this art dealer who threw Debbie in jail, Claude. So Claude, the very first thing that Debbie does almost when she comes out of jail is to go and, cut buttons off his shirt and threaten him with a shiv.
Oh my God. I was meaning to call you. Jesus, it's great to see you. You look...
Recently incarcerated?
Wonderful. You look wonderful.
Do you know what a shiv is?
Okay, stop. Just stop.
No, such a nice face. Inside, you're what we call a pretty girl.
I'll call the police.
Okay. You know what we do with snitches?
We saw you.
Oh, yeah.
Why would you do something like that?
Closure?
Bullshit.
And then, as you said, throughout the film, we find out what he did to her.
You have the right to an attorney. You cannot afford an attorney.
It wasn't my painting. She brought the picture to me. She had documentation, the signatures.
And you two were dating?
What?
Not saying a word.
Are you sure? Because he's not being quite as tight-lipped as you are.
And a lot of the plot is about her setting him up for the fall for their crime.
Well, that's what emerges. I think ultimately all these films are experienced linearly by the audience. Our relationship with the film will change at the end, but the revelation of information is very important. We've talked about that a lot. And it's specifically very important with all these films because your relationship with the film is experienced through that linear relationship. And at the beginning, we're told that the goal is to steal this necklace, and we're not sure that she's planning to use the boyfriend. And in fact, Cate Blanchett kind of warns her about, why did you go and see him? He's a dickhead. And then it's kind of a surprise to us that Debbie Ocean wants to involve him in the plan because she's going to set him up as the date with Daphne. And everyone's kind of worried that...
Well, just Lou.
Why can't you just do a job? Why does it always have to be an asterisk? You frame him, I walk.
Stop.
This is just like last time.
Lou. He sent me to jail. You have no idea what that's like.
Yeah, well, he's gonna do it again.
No, he's not. He's not.
What I'm trying to boil down to is I think the major difference between Ocean's 8 and Ocean's 11 is that the film itself is less concerned about the heist in Ocean's 8 than it is in Ocean's 11. The joy in Ocean's 11 is the stakes of breaking into the casino are really well established, like how hard it's going to be. And then the actual heist sequence is a series of payoffs to misdirects. As you said, like in essence, I think Ocean's 11 lies to its audience more than Ocean's 8 does in relation to the heist. So, you know, a particular example is the older character in Ocean's 11, Soleil. He's like, I don't know, Eastern European arms dealer, pretender, but you've got a lot of scenes leading up to the heist where he's like feeling faint and looking like he's going to have a heart attack and all those kind of things. And then during the heist, he does actually have a heart attack. And so the film has made you think, oh shit, is this something going wrong? Was that supposed to happen? And then it turns out it was part of the heist.
It's using your genre, your expectations of the genre, which is, you know, if we see the plan, it's going to go wrong. If we don't see the plan, then it's going to go right. That's kind of the rule of thumb. But Ocean's 11 plays with that. And it's like, just because we've been told the plan doesn't mean it's the actual plan. It's just what they've told us or told the people they're going along with.
And the real satisfaction at the end is that what we were told was the plan was never the plan. And that everything that happened was planned. But
so in a way, Ocean's 11's doing exactly what, you know, it's a versus audience film.
In a different way to Ocean's 8. Because Ocean's 8, the plan is not carefully laid out for us, right? So we don't know when the plan is going wrong. It's not actually about the heist. When we're in the heist sequence, there's lots of micro points of tension. The only one that I can really remember that's a very kind of plot tense bit of the heist is when the Mindy Kaling character is in a toilet, like dismantling the jewels and replacing them with zirconium, and there's an Israeli hitman guard, approaching the door, right? But other than that, the heist seems to go exactly as they want it to, without us knowing whether that was the plan or not, right? And then the last sequence of the film is actually kind of the aftermath of the heist.
It's again using your expectation because you're like, I thought they've just won. Mm-hmm. Why is the film still going?
So that was, to me, the major difference between Ocean's 8 and Ocean's 11 is that there are micro obstacles. Like every single scene in the film, even the initial like scenes of bringing the team together, there's all these, like, each individual scene has a goal, has antagonism, obstacles to be overcome, and they do. But there doesn't seem to be this overarching drive towards anything. And I'm not saying that as criticism. This is what I actually think is quite astounding about the film. The film is just the joy of being with these characters.
It's definitely a hangout show, but I think you're underselling the value of having scenes that are entertaining within themselves, because there's obstacles or there's moments of surprise and revelation, which again is an audience thing. So, you know, you've got probably the one that stuck out to me the most as an example of this is when they need to basically go and get a photograph of the necklace, 3D, with these fancy cameras to get, so they can build a replica of it. And they send Helen Bonham Carter's character, whose name escapes me. Rose, you're Rose, who's a disgraced fashion designer, and Amita, who's the Mindy Kaling character, to go and get the photographs of the necklace. And essentially there's a few characters in there that work for the
Cartier.
Who work for Cartier, and they need to get the photos. And basically there's not, and it's, you know, it's a spy gadget. Glasses will do the model, and they're down there and they don't have reception.
We're too far on the ground. Can't get a signal.
Very secure down here, huh?
5 feet of solid concrete.
You said you wanted to see it in the light. You wanted to see the necklace in the light.
Right.
This is light.
No. She means real light. Natural light, yes. The red carpet, well, it happens while the sun is still out. Yes. No, I'm afraid that's vital.
It's vital.
No, I must have the sun.
She must have the sun.
How is this light, Miss Vile?
Yes, I think. Yes, we have the sun. Much better.
If you're done, Miss Vile, we'd like to return this to the vault. Miss Vile? Miss Vile.
Yes!
And that's a small micro, as you say, micro plotted scene, but it's still a scene with obstacles. So we're not saying that this film is without conflict at all. It's without interpersonal conflict, and it's not necessarily sequence level. I guess on one level, there is a sense of pressure of like, we need to get all our shit together before the Met Gala, but you never really feel the time pressure. They could have pushed it more if they wanted to. The biggest obstacle, which is kind of the midpoint just before the heist, is we learn that there's a special magnetic lock on the necklace that they thought they could just do a sleight of hand and take it off Anne Hathaway's neck. And turns out it uses some special magnetic lock. But then there's just a small sequence where it turns out that Rihanna's badass sister could make them an unlocking mechanism. But it does, like, this is a structure. It's we need to do this, but this, therefore we make a decision to do that. You know, almost every single scene, if not every single scene, has that.
But
structure.
my broader point is, what is impressive about it is not doing the hero's journey, and it's not even doing, you know, what is the, as you say, the genre convention of heist movies, which has almost been reestablished by Ocean's 11. So it's almost subverting that by saying, we're not going to tell you what the plan is. We're then not going to, you know, subvert what you think the plan was, although they kind of slightly do at the end with the big reveal, but as in they were stealing something else other than the Cartier necklace. But yeah, that it's basically sustained through micro conflict on a scene level,
and our relationship with wanting to know how they're going to pull it off. So when they pull off the heist, we don't have all the information. We just got the bigger beats of it, and it's like, oh, they're trying to make a vomit. Okay, what are they doing? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. You know, these characters are completely aware of what the plan is. We're not, right? And so part of the joys is that those connective moments when we as an audience go 1 + 1 = 2. That we have those sparking moments that exist. Those moments exist purely for our pleasure, rather than that moment of revelation, that closing of the information gap, the correction of point of view. We are catching up to these characters. So much of this film is about us being behind the characters.
Yeah,
you know?
and I think I want to make that broad point. Unlike Ocean's 11, where the film is deliberately misdirecting you, I don't feel that this film is deliberately misdirecting you. It's the way that it's playing with you as an audience is through POV. And, you know, we've done whole episodes on micro use of POV and then macro use of POV, and that's what it's doing here. It's constantly withholding information and then letting you catch up to the characters.
And the biggest withholding information is in the spoilers, what is more or less the final sequence of the film. It feels like a 4-act film, but it's not. It's like a 3-act, I guess, because there's the planning of the heist, and the aftermath. And there is a sequence-level antagonist, which is James Corden's as John Fraser, who's the insurance fraud investigator.
First of all, I'm not a member of law enforcement. I work with the insurance carrier, which means I'm either looking for fraud or I'm looking for the real necklace. Beyond that, I couldn't care less.
I'm afraid you won't find either here.
Well, we'll see about that.
So James Corden comes along. He's the insurance fraud investigator trying to make sure that Cartier isn't doing a dodgy for this $150 million sequence. That's putting on pressure on the characters in the final sequence. But this is something they do in Logan Lucky, when the Hilary Swank character comes along. In a way, it's like the Little Miss Sunshine boss of the
pageant,
of the beauty pageant being like a sequence level antagonist for the final sequence. James Corden there putting on pressure, and we learn through his investigation as he kind of pulls the noose around them, following the threads, that the plan is to actually frame Claude Becker. And ultimately what happens, which makes us go, is, much to our disappointment, Debbie Ocean kind of gives over she doesn't give over everything. She frames him and gives away all the money. And we're like, oh, why did she do that? And it turns out that there was a heist within a heist, which we have explained at the very end, that really the whole thing itself was a magic trick to make a distraction, a sleight of hand, to make everyone focus on this disappeared Cartier necklace where they robbed the Met Museum. And with what's his face from the Ocean's film.
Yeah.
The whole film is a sleight of hand. We've been lied to that their goal, we've told the goal at the beginning is to steal the necklace. It turns out the goal was to steal the necklace in order to frame the boyfriend and distract everyone from them stealing all these royal jewels. That's it.
Can Can I do... I want to make one point, is that where I feel like this film lost steam... There was definite pleasure in watching the James Corden sequence, but I felt like because they'd gotten away with the heist of the Cartier necklace at that point, and they had gotten away with it. There was no chance of them being caught, right? James Corden was investigating, but it wasn't like you felt at any point he was closing in and anyone was... that Debbie wasn't in control of the situation.
Right, I'm going to make this easy for you. I don't want you. I just want the necklace. I don't care. I'll say I found it in a cab.
How about some of it?
How much?
Hypothetically, 10%.
And where's the hypothetical rest?
Oh, I don't know. Literally.
God, this is exhausting.
So let's just say, for argument's sake, that I do know where there's a part of that necklace. Can you get a search warrant?
I'd need probable cause.
Well, we may or may not be working on that right now.
So there was a definite... While it subverted the expectations of the genre to carry on the film after they pulled off the heist, there was a definite feeling like the film took off its foot off the gas because there was no real stakes. And...
Well, she ends up having a meeting. Debbie ends up having a meeting with James Corden. I was like, here you go. And so again, it takes the stakes and we're like, okay, what's her plan now? We are once again catching up to where she's at. We're behind and then we want to learn.
Yeah. And that's it's making us lean forward, it's making us curious, but there's no stakes there.
Yeah. And maybe that's what people are reacting to, that the stakes, once it goes into that, feels low. The other observation I'm going to make now is that there's no big... If we're saying that it's about pressuring these characters to make choices, particularly to make choices that they wouldn't have otherwise make, it doesn't feel like there's any big choice for Debbie or any of them at the very end. The choice could have been that maybe she decides not to dob in her Claude into drug pleasure, or that she's got some other, difficult choice, but she doesn't. There's no actual difficult choice for her at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, there's no character development really for any of the characters. They're not changed. I mean, some of them want money, but none of them, it feels like, other than Awkwafina's character, need money. Like when we're introduced to them, they're all kind of perfectly happy.
Maybe Mindy Kaling's character, Mita, feels like she might need money.
Yeah. She's, the thing that got her on board. I mean, she's the only one where it felt like she had a really convincing reason to come on board the heist. It was to move out from being with her mum.
Yeah. So there's, a lot of enjoyment in the film, but it's about it pulling the rug over the audience's eyes. Deliberately it is a misdirection. The whole film itself is a misdirection.
Yes, but I feel, and I'm, so we've got regular listener Ben, who I think was really frustrated by this film, and I got what he was saying, which is the misdirect that they were actually stealing the jewels. He personally saw it a mile off. Like, as soon as they saw that the jewels were in the museum, he's like, oh, that's what they're really stealing. So he didn't get that sense of satisfaction from the reveal at the end of the film. I didn't have that pickup, but to me, I didn't even really care at that point either. Them realizing that they'd stolen the jewels from the Met wasn't what satisfied me about the film. I guess because, it never felt like... I guess I feel like I'm sounding really critical of this film, and what I actually want people to go away and do is watch it to marvel at, here is a film that is made a satisfying, interesting experience almost from scene to scene, rather than looking at the overall aspect of it, because the heist was so secondary, and I think your main point is a fantastic one. Like, the main tool that it uses to create conflict between the film and the audience, and also to maintain audience interest, is using POV. The audience is constantly behind the film, and it's just letting us catch up ever so regularly, just to keep us tagged, keep bringing us along with it, keeping us engaged.
Yeah, even just looking at the open sequence with Debbie coming out of prison and she's got not much and she's like, I'll sort it out. And it's the pleasure of watching her enact the plan of how she ends up staying in a hotel. It's actively hostile is not perhaps the right word, but I think it is. Like, it's actively hostile in that they're making a conscious decision that Debbie doesn't walk in and go, I'm going to stay in this. This is my plan and this is what I'm going to do. We get to watch it unfold. And you can't maintain that point of view because audiences do get frustrated, but this film lets you catch up. Oh, that's what she's trying to do. That's what she's trying to do. Isn't she clever? Isn't she clever? Isn't she clever? She's super competent, and it makes the film, as you say, enjoyable from moment to moment. Surprise. It gives us all these constant surprises, and jokes are often surprises, and this film to me is very funny. It's a film structured around surprise rather than, revelation, but not suspense. Like, we're not massively ahead of it. That's it. I think you've just hit the nail on the head. Unlike, I think, Ocean's 11 and other heist films, it isn't about suspense, it's about surprise. Yeah. All right.
So that was our fluffy entry into how, films can, have less interpersonal or plot antagonism. And in that absence, the film is more the antagonist.
So I think this is a good opportunity to go to the most common genre, I think, for this kind of active hostility is thrillers and psychological thrillers that play with time. They're kind of puzzle films in a way. I think probably for most audiences, most writers listening to this, they're more likely to write one of those than Sans Soleil or F is for Fake. And so I think that, and it builds on the kind of techniques that we've seen in Ocean's 8, which is point of view and what character's point of view. And so I think this is basically me trying to awkward. I'm trying to awkward into the second.
I've sent the caretaker away so we won't be disturbed.
Hey, it's me. I can't wait to see you.
How long she staying?
Couple of days.
I don't know if that's good. Pages.
Yeah. Well, it's the beginning of something.
Well, come on, don't hold us in suspense.
I can see potential.
Really?
Two women, the dark secret away for the week.
God, can we have some fun now?
Look at you. You're already under a spell.
Gotta be careful, snakes. Those two girls. Fucking snakes.
What are you saying? She said it was an accident.
You said it was an accident. She avoided the question.
Are you saying she didn't write the book?
It's not true. She's jealous of me.
I mean, she's good, but she's not as good as me.
This is what happens when you make up stories.
Now you know the end. I hope you're not disappointed.
So the second is a recent Australian release. It is, as you say, Stu, a thriller. It's set in a remote but very beautiful, expensive house in rural Queensland. Feels very sort of outback-y, and deals with a writer, her publisher, and her muse, as she's credited, and the kind of psychosexual tensions and reveals of backstories and lies and deceit as they all kind of slowly mentally unravel.
It's a good summary, Chaz.
Ah, why, thank you. I feel like, I mean, you may cut this in the edit, but I have to kind of declare my interest here where I'm working with the producer of the film on another project, and I got to read...
I like how that's what it's like. Rather than just saying I read the script for the producer, you're like, I'm working with the producer.
Well, no, because that's my second point of conflict, which is I read the script for this film, a development script, so that obviously tainted my viewing and experience of the film. And I'm also I'm not sure how available this is to overseas listeners, because this is the first film produced by Australia's main streaming competitor to Netflix, which is called Stan. So it was almost a day and date release. I think the theatrical window was only 2 weeks, and it's one of the first ones experimenting with that release model here in Australia. And so I don't know whether it's available on iTunes or Google overseas. We'll ask the producer.
What's important to note is the film is very centrally concerned about lying. I think it must be the kind of turning point, is this idea that the author's book was a memoir. And it was kind of saucy, and that there's some dark, and I don't think that's the midpoint, isn't it?
It's around the midpoint that, the Muse character reveals that it wasn't a memoir of the author's life. The author has basically just been stealing the Muse's life and mining it, and not, potentially is the writer.
What are you doing?
I'm shining light on the shadow of greatness.
So if it wasn't an accident, what happened?
Why don't you ask her? And while you're at it, ask her about a memoir. For someone who trades in lies, you're pretty dim.
You say she didn't write the book?
Tap, tap, tap on the keyboard. Pretty easy to make that sound.
And there's a through plot that the writer is writing about, she's almost writing the story of those three characters within the house. So, novel within the novel that's reflecting them, as they talk about a childhood experience that the two girls shared growing up, where there was an incident with it where a young boy drowned, and it turns out, or is revealed through the story, that they, arguably murdered him, although there's an element of self-defense in there.
It's unreliable because, so Rachel Blake plays the writer and Susie Porter plays the Muse and Vince Colosimo plays the publisher. And I say that in case we interchangeably use their actors' names, given that they don't have any character names. The writer warns the publisher when the Muse arrives at her invitations. The writer is invited the Muse off screen.
But we don't, that's actually a reveal. We get to see phone messages. It feels like when the Muse arrives that she's just kind of dropping in uninvited, and then it's kind of revealed later that the writer actually brought her in because she was suffering from writer's block and needed her Muse.
Which is, okay, so this is a good example of what this film does throughout, which is withholding information for us, the audience, rather than from the characters. This is very much a film in which what we know and what the characters know are not aligned. They're not... The point of view is not about helping us understand and feel for the characters. It's about creating an experience for us, kind of a metatextual experience, right? Does that make sense? I think like Memento is a great example. This, we could have done Memento as an example, but it was nice to do an Australian film made by an Australian female filmmaker rather than, fucking Christopher Nolan. But ultimately, Christopher, the Memento structure is about the audience experiencing that rather than it kind of getting us into Ibis's head. This is similar.
I think what this film does to distinguish itself from Memento is very interesting in how it... So Memento, it never lies to the audience. It's very much a versus audience film because, like you said, with these kind of puzzle thrillers, the way that they're keeping the audience engaged is to constantly make the audience ask questions, be it, what's going on? Where am I? Now, Memento's inherent structure, where it's telling time backwards in sequences, is constantly making, with each reveal of information, the audience reevaluate everything that they've seen before. So that is like Ocean's 8. The main tool is point of view. What does the audience know when? Now, this film plays out fairly linearly,
except for Flash there's flash cuts, so we understand that there's a bit of a frame, and I think that's important because they.
But yes, you carry on, and I'll clarify my point after you.
So there are some flash cuts that build in intensity. So we think it's playing out in linear order, and then there is a moment within the first act, and it's within the first act, where we jump forward to the writer being interviewed, talking about the book.
Let's talk about the story. 2 girls, a boy. The boy dies.
They murder him.
I'd like to read you a passage for comment.
Of course. Oh, you've done your research. Yeah, there was an accident.
A boy died on your property.
Yeah, true.
And you write about a murdered boy.
Everything's fair game.
Everything.
And everyone.
And then we presume it is the book that she has written on this trip, because the setup is that she is going on this trip with the publisher to finish work on her novel.
Her second novel.
The second novel, which is, she's been given, and as we learn, she's been given the advance for it, and it's overdue, and she hasn't started. But we are then told within the first act that she actually succeeds. But then there are questions in that interview that we begin to make us reassess what we are seeing, but it's important because then we know the film reveals to ourselves that the film is a different timeline. You know?
Yeah. So as you said, I mean, I think it's over the opening credits that interview has started. You don't see any visuals, but you can hear it happening. So
yeah.
Thank you for coming.
I don't have much time. Press tours.
You're in demand.
Yeah, it's non-stop.
There's 2 timelines going on, as you say. What we're experiencing as the writing of the book, or the conflict between the 3 characters in the house, intercut with her interview with a woman. One of the reveals that happens is that you think early on that it's a press release interview with a journalist, and then it reveals that it's actually a police detective interviewing the...
and that's a very late reveal. And we very much transgressed to the chagrin of our audience that we're now in conflict with. My point, which was the writer, because it tells the publisher to not trust the muse, and basically everything the muse says will be a lie.
And a word of warning? She's seductive and a devious liar.
I thought she was your friend.
She is.
And so we are immediately distrustful of the muse. We got no information to the contrary, and they start contradicting each other. And soon enough, I mean, this is a very short film, so it feels like I'm probably compressing it in some ways. After one night, they decide to throw the muse out because she's going to be too much of a distraction.
So how's the writing coming on?
It's fine.
It's not what he said.
Yeah? What did he say?
He said you were struggling.
Well, maybe I am, a little bit. Anyway, it's normal after such success.
That's normal after such success.
How much you want this time?
I don't want your money.
Well, what then? Say it. This was a mistake. You should go.
You don't have to struggle.
And Rachel Blake's character kind of nods her head. Yes, she does. She wants help with her second book. But in fact, the muse says, I can give you the second book. But yes, she does. She wants help with her second book. And her and the writer have a plan that we come up with a plan that we are not privy to. But when we don't see what they discuss, there is a time jump. So again, the film is withholding it. I think that is more or less the first act turning point.
Can I make a broad structural observation about the film, and then we can dive into specifics?
Yeah, of course. We're just, man, this whole episode is versus audience. It's going to be novel. We are mementoing our own podcast.
So what it turns out, as the film plays out, other than the cutaways to the interview, it feels fairly linear. We keep getting cutaways to her in the house writing by herself, and we think that that's when the publisher and the muse are elsewhere. Either they're out on a run or they're drinking or whatever. And so...
Because they're being told to give her 6 hours of peace.
So we think that that's happening linearly. Now, what I think the film does very cleverly is as it goes on, what you begin to realize is those scenes with the author by herself.
Okay.
Her clothes don't...
I think it's important. I'm going to let you do it. I'm interrupting you because that's a us versus audience conflict. I know you got a goal. But I think that's a really good observation because it's a good rule of thumb for timelines. So timeline A, timeline B, and timeline C, and they all seem to be unfolding. They themselves are linear.
Yes.
The interview with what is revealed as the police detective, but that's a revelation based on the questions. The questions themselves start like a press and get more and more pressure on the writer. The writing of the story that we hear is intercut corresponds to the events that we are also seeing. So there is a question of like, is she just basically writing a memoir of the setup is such that we believe that she's the muse, and the writer's plan is for the muse to literally be a source of antagonism on the publisher in order to give the writer something to write about. You know, that was my interpretation, but I think that's what it's you led to believe, that it was some kind of plan where they were pushing him along. Though it starts to get more and more murky about, like, it's like, how the fuck did they knew he was going to do that? Mm-hmm. You know, you start questioning their ability to realize almost the coincidences.
Yeah.
Anyway, now you can continue because I think I'm just giving context for your observation.
Thank you. So what you begin to realize is that the scenes where she's writing the book are not actually the same timeline as the action that's playing out, the interplay between the three characters. And you realize this because her clothes don't change. She's always in the same outfit. And the edits are very clever. They actually go increasing the audience's awareness of that it's a separate timeline. So, for example, Vince Colosimo gets to the point where he grabs the author by the neck and pushes her against the wall, and you then jump cut to her as the author saying he grabs her by the neck and pushes her against the wall and calls her a fucking bitch. So we suddenly then realize, oh, this is happening at a different time. Then the final kind of bit where the final lie of the film that gets revealed to you is that it isn't her in a different timeline remembering what's happened and writing the book. It turns out that everything she wrote is potentially a work of fiction. You don't know whether it's real or not. And
kind of the key choice that we think, and I'm going to jump in before you spoil it because I think it's very clever. It's a binary choice. Essentially, they put down a police statement relating to this dead boy.
When they were young girls.
Kids. So the muse and the writer were caught up with the death of a boy by drowning, right? And then they put a book, and she put books down that contradicts that event, those events, and makes it sound like it was more deliberate. And the film plays with whether or not you should believe it was sexual assault or not. And I would say that I personally felt uncomfortable with how I was meant to feel about it in the context of Me Too. Because the writer just sits there and watches it happen, but it doesn't look like she's scared to intervene.
No.
And it's like, so there's some writing on this film that I'm going to share that kind of deal with those aspects of sexual trauma and stuff like that, because it's something that possibly I can't access. But the police detective puts down the book relating to and the statement and says which one of those is true.
One is a sworn statement of truth, and one is a complete fiction. But which one is which?
Please, isn't it obvious?
And the writer, rather than giving an answer, says, isn't it obvious? Meaning it's actually asking the question of the audience. This, coming back to my observation at the very beginning about pressuring the character to make a choice between, say, two things. You know, Luke, do you believe in the Force or not? It's actually reframing it and making a question, which one do you believe? And then you're like, okay, all right, okay, I think I realize what's happened is what you think at that point is that they, or I did anyway. I think other audiences will have a different experience. In that moment, I am like, okay, her and the Muse have orchestrated the events, which escalate with the publisher effectively being dragged down to the river and their gun in the head and someone shooting themselves in suicide because he was the brother of the boy that was killed, and it was related to the boy potentially sexually abusing the Muse. That you're sitting there going, okay, one of them is a memoir and the other one's the police statement, right? And that they orchestrated these events so the publisher would believe it. I thought it was about getting the publisher to believe what they were saying so she could write a memoir that was not true, but he was kind of be able to witness it and verify it.
Yeah.
And then the film does something else.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. What you think as you're watching the film is that these guys are kind of going a little bit crazy because these women, now grown women, but ever since they were girls, have this very kind of twisted, incestuous relationship. The publisher's worried that his author isn't the author of the book that he'd published, nor the one that he's going to publish. And he's then also kind of wrapped up in, I don't have a book, and I also think this person is lying about being a murderer. And they are then kind of framing him for sexual assault and other things to murder him and, you know, almost recreate the exact same thing that happened to them allegedly when they were girls, and then be the fodder for the novel.
Self-defense, yeah. And it be the fodder for the memoir.
Yeah. Now, the key lie, and it's really highlighted, I'm glad you mentioned that one of the characters committed suicide, because one of the key lies, you then see that character in the police station as the author is walking out, alive, having made the complaint. Like, you read the book and said, oh, these women, obviously, this is a confession that they murdered my brother, and he's there. So what that does to me is, as you said, it's a puzzle film. It's making you lean forward. It's making you ask questions. How does this all fit? But it undoes the truth or the reliability of anything that you've previously seen. You have no idea. Well, I think you can reliably say they then show her at the launch at a book reading, and clearly the publisher never went with her to the house. Clearly the Muse never went with her to the house. You have no idea.
The publisher and the Muse, well, I don't know, the publisher may have gone to her at the house, but we've never seen them together in that alternate timeline.
They'd never met.
Importantly, the Muse and the publisher have never met.
Yeah. So, I mean, nothing that we've seen for the entire film, except for the police interview, can we confidently, within the world of the film, know happened or not. And that's the point of it. That's the thrill of it, the joy of it, the satisfaction of it is in the film lying to the audience and then making the audience reassess everything that they've seen.
And then this will tie, we haven't mentioned it yet, but this episode is going to very nicely segue into our next episode, which we've already recorded, which is on thematic sequences with Stephen Cleary. Because in a way, this film, the whole point of that revelation is for you to reconsider the film on a thematic level, not to me, you know, and we know the producer, Leanne, listens to the podcast, so this is kind of to her. You know, to me, it makes you reassess it on a thematic level, not necessarily an emotional one.
Yeah.
As has been observed with these puzzle films, probably because they're prickly towards the audience, they actually distance you from emotionally engaging, with the films. And I think the point of this ending of I got really invested. Like I put this film on at like 1 o'clock last night to prep for this podcast, and I was up to 3 to finish it. Like I was like, I thought I was only going to watch half, but no, I watched and then the other half this morning. No, I had to stay up and finish it. Like I was really engaged with it. And that moment where it was like revelation and then the double revelation was like, made me reassess the film on a thematic level about what it was saying, particularly in the context of assault. I mean, I think you could look at it as a kind of airport thriller that's about the puzzle and that's it. And the revelation that it was all, that basically we've watched the film reenactment of the book intercut with her writing the book. Yeah. That's one way of reviewing the film. I think it's meant to be a little bit more complicated than that. And that's part of what I'm going to think about, and that's why there's some think pieces about it. So
there's a lot of complex stuff in the interplay between the characters, but unfortunately that reveal at the end makes you go, well, none of that happen? So then...
Well, I assume it happened on some... Well, they talk about being...
emotional level.
Yeah, it's kind of like her dramatizing... Is the writer confessing to something that she did, but she's making it dramatized? That's what I mean about you ponder at the end of the film, the conflict and the choice for the audience is not about these characters making a choice. It's for you, it forces you to consider what the film is about. And, you know, this is one of those films that people are going to watch it and go, I don't get it. And if people say, I don't get it about a film, they're probably watching a film whose central conflict is with the audience. And look, they mightn't get it because they're watching a film that is effectively in another language, to use my example at the beginning, right? Because you're watching something that's so far outside your understanding of cinematic language. And we've all got like there's music I listen to that people are going to listen to and just go, what the fuck is that shit? You know, I'm listening to Gnaw Their Tongues recently and it's so outside the boundaries of what most people consider songs. But that actually, to be honest, that music is designed to antagonize the audience, that it's about forcing you to go, you know, that's kind of like a thematic question of the music itself. This kind of structure can be, look, I haven't seen Nocturnal Animals, but I think Nocturnal Animals is probably a film, you're saying it doesn't lie to the audience, but the structure is about engaging you and forcing you to think about films. I mean, probably even like The Talent of Mr. Ripley does this on some level. There are a lot of films that structurally are about being actively hostile to the audience in terms of us engaging and connecting with the films.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Or understanding what's going on.
Nocturnal Animals, it's an interesting companion piece to this because it's about a character whose ex-husband has written a book and he sent her the book, and as she's reading the book, the lead character in the book that she's reading is played by Jake Gyllenhaal, and as she's reading the book, she is remembering her relationship with her ex-husband, who is played by Jake Gyllenhaal. And by doing that, you always know as an audience, it doesn't lie to you because you always know when she's reading the book. You always know which timeline is the book and which timeline is her life. And it's doing it to deliberately make you understand how the book is a metaphor for their relationship previously and how that makes her feel as a character re-experiencing her relationship through his eyes, which is very different. Like, it's not structurally antagonistic in the way that the second is. It's antagonistic through other means. It's a very transgressive film.
Okay.
But
it's not actively hostile to the audience.
No.
So maybe a better example, which is something we talked about for this, that was on our vote list, which was Mulholland Drive.
Yeah. I think if you go to any David Lynch work, that is actively hostile to the audience, and you know, those moments of hostility, as you say, this would tie in neatly with our thematic sequences episode with Stephen Cleary coming up next. But often when you're forced to constantly,
or on early access for patrons,
when you are constantly asking yourself, what is going on, why am I watching this? And I think this will segue neatly into Sans Soleil and F for Fake. Those films do that so constantly that you end up watching it asking yourself, what is this about? It kind of pushes you through the questions of, why is this person doing this? Where are they? What are they doing? What do they want? To a point of, why am I watching this? Why am I being told this information?
Which seems like a good segue, speaking about lying and why am I watching this? To F for Fake, which actually does a disservice, because I think F for Fake is actually a pretty amusing film. It's got some funny one-liners, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a lot less self-serious than I love Sans Soleil, which we're doing afterward. I mean, maybe we should do F for Fake and Sans Soleil kind of together.
Yes.
I mean, I love Sans Soleil and I want to hear it out, and you should all watch it, but it's really fucking hard to get your whole, in America, you can buy it on Blu-ray and it'll play in your Blu-ray players. As we discovered buying the Blu-ray for this podcast, it doesn't play in Australian Blu-ray players unless you got a multi-region. Talking about being actively hostile to your audience, not being able to play it.
Ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, this is a film about trickery. fraud, about lies. Tell it by the fireside or in a marketplace or in a movie. Almost any story is almost certainly some kind of lie. But not this time. No, this is a promise. During the next hour, everything you'll hear from us is really true and based on solid facts.
You don't talk about Napoleon or Julius Caesar. You're talking about Elmire.
Elmire?
Elmire?
Who is Elmire? That question has yet to be answered with any real precision. He's a leading actor in this movie. His profession, it's true, is painting fakes. Among all fakers, Elmire is number 2.
Ones?
The important distinction to make when you're talking about the genuine quality of a painting is not so much whether it's a real painting or a fake. It's whether it's a good fake or a bad fake.
So it's a... F for Fake is a 1973 kind of doco-drama. Some people describe it as a film essay, which is co-written and directed by and stars Orson Welles, who worked on the film with Francois Rickenbach, his Oja Korda, who's in the film and also claims to have written part of the film. And it's kind of more or less, well, it is the last completed film by Orson Welles. And, oh man, it's a really hard film to describe, which is that it ostensibly is about Elmire recounting his career as a professional art forger. And it's kind of, but the film itself is this meandering kind of conversation about the nature of authorship, authenticity, and the value of art. Because the point is like, yeah, okay, this guy, and it made you re-question what you're willing to accept as forgery, because the idea is that Elmire claims to have sold a bunch of forgeries to galleries around the world who don't want to admit that they've bought forgeries once it's come out that, like, he was potentially making forgeries. And that's kind of more or less the thematic idea, which is in the end, and the film raises it, on a long enough timeline, no one's going to give a shit if it's a forgery.
Well, whoever did sign them, his paintings are in so many great collections that surely it must be said of Elmire that he has achieved a certain immortality under various other signatures.
If you hang them in a museum or in a collection, great paintings, and if they hang long enough there, they become real.
So the film is narrated by Orson Welles, and he is as you said, he stars in it, like he's a character in it. And I think this is how it will link to Soleil, is it very much, his talking to the audience is a big part of what keeps the audience engaged. Now, he ostensibly starts out talking about these two inhabitants of this Spanish island. One of them is Elmire. The other is Elmire's biographer, who told the world about Elmire. And then, according to the film...
And it's true, I looked it up. It's true.
Sure. Like, let me make the point that he... according to the film, he then pretended to... Was it co-write something with Howard Hughes?
He said he wrote the biography, the authorized biography of Howard Hughes.
Did Howard Hughes exist? Irving insisted that he did. Hughes denied the existence of Irving.
No, I never saw him. I never even heard of him.
Don't believe a word of it, said Irving. And believe it or not, almost nobody did. Why, they were partners, Hughes and Irving, said Irving. They were doing a book together, and now the Hughes mystery would be solved.
Yeah, okay. Now... I feel like there's a lot of that film that would be less antagonistic, F for Fake, if we were of that time. Because I think the Howard Hughes scandal would have been we would have come into that film with a lot of built-in knowledge. Because F for Fake, it constantly raises a question, makes the audience lean forward, and then as it's building towards the answer for the question, cuts away to a brand new story. So there's a sequence, it will cut away to the two ones that stick out in my mind, because that's the other thing to admire about the film, is that it does have standalone sequences. It's antagonistic to the audience because it keeps on raising questions, involving you in a story. So there is narrative there. It involves you in the story and then pulls the rug out from under you by just going off and telling a different story. And then, there's in a very kind of postmodernist style, there's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of back and forth. But two of the standalone stories that he starts talking about is one is Picasso's infatuation with a young girl who walks past his window every day.
Who's played by Coda herself, which we are introduced at the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
Walking past all these guys. Yeah.
She comes into this when she herself came to the attention of who else but the first genius among all the artists of our age. The most celebrated, certainly the wealthiest painter in 6,000 years.
Well, Picasso is the biggest phenomenon of our time. It never existed that a painter was able, with one movement of his hand, what necessarily didn't involve more than 10 seconds, that movement of the hand transformed in gold. Not even John D. Rockefeller was able to do that.
And then the other one that really stood out to me is it just keeps cutting away to him giving narration in different locations, and he keeps coming back to him at a dinner party with friends in a restaurant, and he's giving narration, and then eventually it stays with him in the restaurant, and he starts telling this story about this other Hungarian artist and forger.
Here's Vertish, all round us. Vertish had to be charming. He was Hungarian. He started his career, and he told me this right here at this table, as a charlatan. I painted fake masterpieces. I began, he said, as Lautrec.
A woman, a titled English woman, walked in one day to my room, and she saw on the wall, pinned on the wall, a drawing. I say, hey, where you got that Picasso? I say, well, do you think it's a Picasso?
And that was this art dealer. I won't give you his name. Turning down everything I showed him. This is Vertish speaking. When something caught his eye. Where did you get that, he said? That nice little Lautrec. I told him it was a very nice little Vertish. I'll take the Lautrec, he said. And if you happen to find any more, bring them in.
And then never really comes back to it at all, nor gives any conclusion to the story. And it's very deliberate. It's those are the two the main tool I feel of F for Fake to be antagonistic to you is to keep cutting away, like to keep going on tangents, as is a common Draft Zero approach. And then he even tells you at the beginning, I'm not going to lie to you for an hour.
This is a promise. During the next hour, everything you'll hear from us is really true and based on solid facts.
And then at the end of the film, tells this huge story that he then tells you is complete bullshit because it happened after an hour of runtime had elapsed.
What I mean is, with a story this hard to believe, reenactment isn't easy. Right, Francois? At the very beginning of all this, I did make you a promise. Remember? I did promise that for 1 hour, I'd tell you only the truth. That hour, ladies and gentlemen, is over. For the past 17 minutes, I've been lying my head off.
It's a film that is constantly making you lean forward and go, ooh, it engages you through narrative, but then undermines and subverts narrative constantly. And by doing that, it makes you sit back and go, what is this film actually about? And it helps that it has a person there telling you, ostensibly, what it's about.
It's pretty. But is it art? It's pretty, but is it art? Well, how is it valued? The value depends on opinion. Opinion depends on the experts. A faker like Elmire makes fools of the experts, so who's the expert? Who's the faker?
There are some nice editing techniques which I want to point out.
Amazing.
Because these are amazing editing techniques, and some of them are purely editorial. But it's a good option just to kind of recap from both the second, because the second does it, which it does these flash cuts, and this film does as well, which is kind of these moments where the film, like it, as we said, it goes onto tangents, but they are things that that screenwriters can put in their own material. You can put a flash cut. You can go and have a shot that we're sitting there going, I don't know why I'm seeing this moment. And the film is promising you that it will explain it. And ultimately, F for Fake kind of does, even if it's got this effusive, meandering style. Ultimately, it does set things up and then pays them off. I mean, the only thing that
we never hear how Elmire's story or even Irving's story ends.
And it's self-reflective because it brings up his story, and this is what makes it's all historical information, and this will tie to a future episode on character motivations, where it talks about what happened with the War of the Worlds, the infamous radio adaptation with people believing the War of the Worlds was true. And so Wells is connecting it to his personal experience with being a faker, and he faked himself. So the film kind of becomes unreliable because it's not lying all the time. You don't know whether to trust it or not. And our moment was like, I wonder what all this Howard Hughes stuff is true or not, these diaries. Because obviously Howard Hughes is, it's Leonardo DiCaprio, right? Like, that was the Martin Scorsese film, fictional film.
The Aviator.
The Aviator. So I think the film itself is just about the nature of, it's a thematic film. It's about making you question. It's antagonizing the audience. It's being actively hostile to you in terms of it. And the editing style as part of this is making you question, how do we know that things are true? And as much as I disliked the sequence 30 years on where the camera oogles Oja, if that's how you say it in Coda, basically butt shots, and there's these guys walking at her, and you think it's kind of intercut footage, and they're trying to make it look like she was being checked out by these guys, and then it turns out they actually really shot it like reality TV. The film is trying to show the way in which truth can be manufactured through editing, and it does it itself.
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. Why did we pick this film? Because there is no villain. There is no force of nature. There is no system per se, other than there's moments where they talk about the system of art as an industry and art as art criticism and art sales.
All these experts that that stuff's funny. The experts that verify these paintings as real, and it's like how truly experts they are, and then you find out that by saying it's real, they get to sell it for a lot of money, and they don't really want to question it. You happen. Come here, there's a great line we'll include, which is like, you happen to have a lot of whatever the painter is in the bottom drawer, but they don't question it. I think all that stuff is incredibly amusing.
Oh, absolutely. So what we're saying is what keeps you engaged with this documentary. I mean, he could have rolled it out as a documentary where it's just about the satisfaction is in the reveal of the information about these two big fakers, which is what he says the film is about. But then he just sort of at some point casually forgets about them. And the what makes this film engaging and again, as you said earlier on, it's not that we want to encourage our listeners to go out and, probably not even you or I are going to go out and make a film like F for Fake, but it's fascinating to see just how you can pull the rug out from under the audience and make them at that point question, what is this about? It's almost a thematic tool.
Well, I think the observation that you can make is that Orson Welles himself is the antagonistic force personified in this film. We've talked about the film.
So the audience is the protagonist.
We are the protagonist, and he is our antagonist. And I think perhaps that's why what's interesting about doing this episode, this feels like a weird observation to put in the middle of it. I kind of want to do a documentary episode maybe next year where we look at a bunch of really interesting documentaries, because I think their style, because of the way they speak directly to the audience, allows them to do things that you can't in traditional narrative. And I think the only film that doesn't have voiceover that we're doing of the 5 films is Ocean's 8, and it's because they're speaking directly to the audience. And in this, Orson Welles is speaking directly to the audience.
And it turns out in in the second that they are speaking directly to the audience. She's essentially reading us her novel.
Yeah, we are seeing a reenactment of her novel, but we're not told. So I think there is something that you can take from that, and I think just from understanding kind of modern editing, F for Fake is definitely worth looking at as a writer. And I think the story is really kind of fascinating. The whole fakery and where you draw the line.
Oh, I found it fascinating, but it didn't answer any of the questions that it raised.
I mean, the fact that we're debating it shows that it worked, but it was a versus audience. It's about making us ask questions at the very end. Because for me, I think it was about questioning the value of art. What is it that makes a particular person's painting valuable? Because if it's about technical skill, then there's other people that can do the technical skill. It's scarcity. It's about the industry that creates the value out of the art. But then that's why the Oja story at the very end, because basically it comes down to there's this forger that ends up creating a series of paintings that claims they're by Picasso and everyone loves them, but Picasso never painted them, and they're amazing. And then Picasso is really distasteful towards this forger. The forger is like, I've given you the gift of a whole new era of Picasso, and I think as much as that story is fake, it's about that idea,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm not arguing with you there, I guess. Yeah, I'm just
fuck. Oh man, I haven't been recording for 2 hours.
You've been recording for 2 hours?
I haven't been recording. Fucking stopped.
When? I've only got an hour and 37 minutes of recording.
I got 15
minutes.
Yeah. Gotcha. Lying to the audience. And Chaz.
Oh my God. Oh, you bastard. I was already like halfway down the stairs to go to sleep, grateful that I could go to bed early.
Really?
Yep.
Wouldn't we just re-record?
Right now? No.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Now I've done a fake out in our versus audiences episode.
You know why that was a successful fake out is because this has fucking happened to us in the past.
Should we move on to Soleil?
The first image he told me about was of 3 children on a road in Iceland in 1965. He said that for him it was the image of happiness, and also that he had tried several times to link it to other images, but it never worked. He wrote me, "One day I'll have to put it all alone at the beginning of a film, with a long piece of black leader. If they don't see happiness in the picture, at least they'll see the black." He wrote, "I'm just back from Hokkaido, the northern island. Rich and harried Japanese take the plane, others take the ferry. Waiting, immobility, snatches of sleep. Curiously, all of that makes me think of a past or future war. Night trains, air raids, fallout shelters. Small fragments of war enshrined in everyday life."
So it sounds like, look, let's draw the parallels with F for Fake, first of all, which is there is a narrator. And I think that is one of the main ways that it maintains audience engagement is by talking to the audience. The way that it lies, similarly to F for Fake, is that the narration is obviously, well, not obviously, but it's written by the filmmaker, and it's beautiful. It's poetic and observant and amazing, but it is portrayed as being these letters written by, and even is credited as letters written by a fictitious person.
The film is so versus audience, or at least so constructed, is that it completely, Chris Marker does not have credit on the film. And that his letters that are written by him so it's a fictitious, what is it, Sandor Krasner?
Yes, yeah. And not only that, there's another layer in between the audience and the filmmaker, which is the letters are being read by a woman who allegedly, well, we would understand the letters as being written to her from someone who's traveling through Japan, New Guinea, Scandinavia, and Africa and a Pacific island.
So I think you could broadly call the film a travelogue. I guess that's the closest thing, like a travelogue or a documentary. I mean, once upon a, people would put, there is a terribly shit version on this that's like on Vimeo. But that's kind of the structure. Like it is, like in a weird way, it is just travel footage.
Yeah.
But like someone shooting, but they're not in it. We never actually see the fictitious narrator, like this Candor person. We never see them. There's no self-referential, which happens with some documentaries. The kind of, not Errol Morris. There's like Sherman's March
Louis
and stuff.
Theroux.
Yes. Actually, there's a whole world of like the Bill Brysons and the Louis Theroux, which is about them and their travels, and it's a lot more about their personality. Yeah. Our only experience of this character is oral, and we have this. What's interesting about this film is that I've seen it a number of times, but I've seen it with the English voiceover, and the version that you and I watched is with the French voiceover, and they're both official canon voiceovers, but with subtitles.
And so it's another, for us, it was another frame between us and the material. And you've seen it a number of times, whereas this was my first viewing. I do speak a bit of French, so I wasn't constantly, reading the subtitles, but it's for such a visual experience. I think being forced to read subtitles was a very different experience of it. But often, at least for the first half, a lot of what the visuals are showing you, either in contrast, they're not actually necessarily what the text, what the oral stuff is talking about.
They're talking about the early Japanese court, and there's all the shots of the missiles. That was the one that's the most stark contrast, where you're like, okay, there's a disconnect between what we are seeing and what we're hearing, and then, which is I think where you're going for, the question becomes, why am I seeing this?
Yeah. Shonigan had a passion for lists. The list of elegant things, of distressing things, or even of things not worth doing. One day she got the idea of drawing up a list of things that quicken the heart. Not a bad criterion, I realize when I'm filming. I bow to the economic miracle, but what I want to show you are the neighborhood celebrations.
Yeah. And there's often long stretches of the film where the run of sequence of images we're being shown continues and the narration stops. And in those moments, the only thing that I personally was filling that void with was, why am I being shown these images at this point in time? And there are moments with the film where it does, the visuals and the narration do match up. I remember I've got written here that I love the TV sequence where it's showing like Japanese TV, and he starts talking. The letters start talking about the experience of watching Japanese TV, but then it digresses in the narration, but not in the TV, like not in what you're seeing. And there's lots of jump cuts back to images from the very beginning of the film. Like there's these emus that keep popping up that are on this island in France, and there's people asleep on a train, cross-cutting to this really like sort of violent TV that, to me, I've got written down. It's like commenting on a somnambulant society.
Oh, where he talks about the video effect.
Oh, well,
that's about the video effect. That becomes a thematic.
Yeah.
My pal Hayao Yamaneko has found a solution. If the images of the present don't change, then change the images of the past. He showed me the clashes of the 60s treated by his synthesizer. Pictures that are less deceptive, he says, with the conviction of a fanatic than those you see on television. At least they proclaim themselves to be what they are, images, not the portable and compact form of an already inaccessible reality.
So it's hard for us to talk about this film in any precise moment because, unlike F for Fake did trade in narrative.
It had more or less, F for Fake felt like it had very clear sequences.
Yes.
You had the sequence of the opening of the girl being Googled. Wow. Yeah, they were Googling her in this 1973. There is the moment at the end, the story about Picasso, but then there's the whole thing about War of the Worlds, and then there's the kind of the meat of that story of F for Fake early on is the story about the fakers, and that's only about 15 or 20 minutes, and you're like, is that it? Okay, this guy faked a bunch of paintings, and then it meanders off somewhere else. But there's very clear kind of like, it was episodic in a way.
Yeah.
Unified by Orson Welles' voiceover. And Sans Soleil is episodic, but it's like 1,000 episodes. Like it feels like every 5 minutes is a new. It's like a travelogue. It's like
each letter is a new episode.
Yes,
but they don't feel connected or moving anything because they're observations.
He wrote me, even in the stalls where they sell electronic spare parts that some hipsters use for jewelry, there is in the score that is Tokyo a particular staff whose rarity in Europe condemns me to a real acoustic exile. I mean the music of video games. They are fitted into tables. You can drink, you can lunch, and go on playing. They open onto the street. By listening to them, you can play from memory.
Yeah. And it's He Wrote Me. There is a rhythm to it. Just something we haven't talked about, and that's a good option now, because I was talking about interruption or the obstruction being a thing. So, and this will come to character journeys and broadening our palette, but repetition is like the reason that most jokes are in 3 is 2 is the minimum you need to build the pattern, right? So it's like it's not a great joke, but I can say there's 3 of us on this podcast. There's, me, Chaz, and my beer. And the joke's terrible, but the idea is the pattern is there's humans and there's the surprise at the end. And repetition and the change of repetition or the obstruction or the interruption is kind of what give these things a pattern and make us process information. I'm not sure if I'm articulating that very well, but I'm setting this up now for like 4 episodes time when we start talking about character journeys, because character journeys is all about, character motivation is about the pattern of the character and then the surprise of them doing something that is out of that pattern. And pattern and the breaking of the pattern creates conflict.
Well, what is narrative but pattern recognition, ultimately? And I think...
Rhythm, music is...
Sans Soleil and F for Fake very much trade in rhythm.
Yeah.
Sans Soleil, less of a repeated rhythm, although it does come back right to the end. Yeah.
2 locations, lots of Japan, there's the footage, the horrible... I mean, this film was 1984. It wasn't... I'm not Japanese, so I don't want to speak definitively about the cultural experience, but man, having a couple of atomic bombs dropped on you is going to cast quite the shadow, and the war, the war itself is going to cast a huge shadow over Japan.
On Hayao's machine, war resembles letters being burned, shredded in a frame of fire. The code name for Pearl Harbor was Tora Tora Tora, the name of the cat the couple in Gotokuji was praying for. So all of this will have begun with the name of a cat pronounced 3 times.
I think in some ways the film, as much as it's exotifying Japan, has kind of got this fascination with it.
Absolutely.
And they actually use the word fascination in one of the letters about the nature of fascination.
I found any of the bits in Japan really engaging, and then when it left Japan for these kind of short little episodes, when they went to Africa or to New Guinea or something like that, I was constantly going, I was really getting into that. And then it ends up going back to Japan a lot, which was, rewarding for me anyway. I think we probably made clear just how antagonistic the film Sans Soleil is with its audience through lack of narrative. Is there anything you want to talk about in terms of tools that people could take away from Sans Soleil in particular?
It's rhythm. Actually, the way it feels unified. The film is, because it is so meandering, it's actually the opposite, where these other films are, like the second is interrupting your viewing to give you a flash, as we've implied with Sans Soleil. And it's a film that it's hard to talk about because it's very experiential, I think you kind of have to just watch it, and I think with the subtitles versus if you've got the headspace to watch it with in English, if that's a language you understand, or French, if that's a language you understand. Like, hearing it and then seeing the images, it kind of washes you over experientially, while having to read the subtitles and then having to look at the image was a little bit kind of dividing your attention a little bit too much for me. But the rhythm of the he wrote me. He writes me from Japan. He writes me from Africa. He writes that he can now summon up the look on the face of the market lady of Praia that had lasted only the length of a film frame. Will there be a last letter? Dividing the episodes, the pattern is actually what unified it. That the film, it is to me, Soleil feels less antagonistic or actively hostile to the audience than F for Fake. And I think that's because the rhythm or the structure of the film is actually trying to bring this stuff together. It's trying to unify it all. And that's why it's got this repetition coming back to the zone, as they call it, in this processed video footage.
And the zone being reminiscent of Tarkovsky.
Yeah, of course, which is...
Obviously.
Yeah.
Which is another, with Tarkovsky along with David Lynch... there are a number of different filmmakers who I think dealing in antagonizing the audience is their way, their process, where they sit. Yeah, and they're not actively hostile. They're trying to force you to be actively engaged with the film. They're hostile, but they're not trying to hurt you. I think there's hostility and there's trying to hurt you. I don't think these films are actively hurting you. But they're hostile. But I think in comparison to these films, the traditional Western Hollywood cinematic narrative, what it's trying to kind of do is put you at ease and not necessarily question why you're watching what you're watching until the end of the film. Whereas these films, with the absence of antagonism, the way that they create conflict to keep you engaged is by being in conflict with the audience member, and the result of that is making you constantly go, what is this about?
Yeah. When we started out, because I said this in the poll, I was like, Soleil is the film I definitely want to do. And what is interesting is because we're focusing on versus audience, I think it's a hard film to talk about in this context. Because ultimately, I think I wanted to kind of get into, kind of broadly speaking, like visual aesthetics, like repetition and contrast in particularly, but how rhythm is built both from contrast and patterns and all that stuff. But in a way, I'm not sure that's that useful for screenwriters. I thought it would be. And I still think there is something, you can do a lot that's really formal.
I think it's a beautiful observation.
I think there is some level of formality that you can use. Like, I love David Foster Wallace. He is one of my all-time favorite writers, and he used to, I kind of fucked around with like experimental prose when I was younger. A lot of that was influenced by his formal experiment, and he's not the only author that did that kind of formalism on the prose, but the thing is, prose itself is the medium. And as a screenwriter, as much as I generally believe that screenwriting is an art, the form of screenwriting is not visible to the audience. Dialogue, yes, that you could, and narration, and it's interesting all these films are narrated, that the screenwriter can obviously use some kind of repetitious structure. Or as when we go into Forrest Gump, there is a structure, there is a repetition to how it binds those episodes together. There are just other things, those kinds of aesthetic qualities. I think there is some that the screenwriter can put in their screenplays and have control over, and there are others that are unfortunately going to come through editing, as much as you can allude to it. Someone wrote Soleil, and it was Chris Marker. He wrote the words that are heard, and he wrote the images. He just didn't necessarily write them in 12-point career in a screenwriting program or on a time writer. He wrote them with his camera and his editing equipment. But I think screenwriters should watch it. Because it's so different, because it is something that is, I think it is beautiful, and it is so different, and it's good to remind ourselves that films don't necessarily need to be about good guys versus bad guys and heroes' journeys and all that stuff. Like, we're, talking about this film 25 years later, and I know people are still talking about Raiders of the Lost Ark and stuff like that, but, 80 years or 100 years, people are still definitely going to be talking about Soleil. And maybe a few people at film school talking about the history of 20th century filmmaking, but yeah. Speaking of something more conventional.
Hello, my name's Forrest Gump. Would you like a chocolate?
Oh,
Oh, thank you.
It's funny what a young man recollects.
You're the same as everybody else. You are no different.
Your boy's different.
Are you stupid or something? Mama says stupid is as stupid does. And Jenny. I'm Forrest Gump.
She was my most special friend. My only friend. We was together all the time. We was like peas and carrots, Jenny and I.
Run, Forrest! Hey, stupid, run!
Now, you wouldn't believe it if I told you, but I can run like the wind blows.
Who in the hell is that?
That there's Forrest Gump, Coach. Just a local idiot. I never thought it would take me anywhere. College was very confusing times.
Have you ever been with a girl, Forrest?
I sit next to them in my home economics class all the time.
Have you given any thought to your future?
Go! What's your sole purpose in this army?
To do whatever you tell me, drill sergeant.
You're a damn genius. You are going to be a general someday, Gump.
Yes, drill sergeant!
They sending me to Vietnam.
Can you promise me something, okay? If you're ever in trouble, don't try to be brave. You just run, okay?
Okay. Where you boys from in the world?
Alabama, sir.
For some reason, what I was doing seemed to make sense to people.
Forget about me and get yourself out!
Been awarded the Medal of Honor.
How come? Now, my mama's always telling me how miracles happen every day. Some people don't think so.
Jenny!
But they do. You can come home with me at my house in Greenbow. I'll take care of you.
Why are you so good to me?
You're my girl.
Well, yeah, I think so as you said, Jules suggested Forrest Gump, and when he suggested it, I just started thinking about it. Well, clearly, no, that film must be so conventional, right? Because it's so sort of famously sappy and emotional. But then as I was thinking about it, I was like, well, Forrest Gump, in the film, he's got lots of micro-antagonists, but there's no real villain to the film unless you kind of look at it as a rom-com where he and Jenny are each other's antagonists. But as I was thinking about it, I'm like, we should do this film, and then you rewatched it before I did, and you were like, yes, let's definitely do Forrest Gump, because I think it does do. It's a great film to tie this together because unlike F for Fake and Sans Soleil, while I think there is an absence of antagonist in Forrest Gump, and I do think it is engaging directly with the audience, it's not doing so in an aggressive way, and it shows how you can use these tools to make very engaging material as well, and very material that feels conventional while on a structural level being actually quite remarkable.
To summarize Forrest Gump, for those who haven't seen it, it's based on I'm reading the Wikipedia page. Wow, Wikipedia actually says it's a romantic comedy. Interesting. Forrest Gump is kind of a loose adaptation of the novel of the same name about a slow-witted but kind-hearted, good-natured and brilliant runner, ultimately, from Alabama, Gump. And the story is about him witnessing and, in some cases, slightly influencing some of the defining events of the kind of post-World War II, kind of not even 50, like 50s onwards, 50s to the 80s of American history. And it is extraordinarily, actually, it's not extraordinary. Well, actually, it kind of extraordinarily episodic. Like, you don't see films as episodic as this that much. For those who missed it, it was somewhat of a phenomena. And I'm going to say up front, the one aspect that I think it's versus audiences in is because you see all these moments of, like, Forrest, like, meeting JFK.
They even put me on a thing called the All-America Team, where you get to meet the President of the United States.
Yeah.
And then later, that he's kind of responsible, that Forrest Gump is responsible for
Watergate.
It gets to that, but it starts off with, like, him and Elvis and the dance. Is it the hound dog dance?
Yeah.
Say, man, show me that crazy little walk you just did there. Slow it down some.
You ain't nothing but a
I like that guitar. It sounded good.
And it's kind of like these amusing moments of like, oh, isn't that funny? Forrest Gump taught Elvis how to dance like that when Elvis was singing this song because Forrest was in these braces. And as it comes clearer, it's like him intersecting with history has a bigger influence, at least a bigger influence on that history, or it kind of makes you rethink it. So yes, he accidentally reveals Watergate. But there's also him kind of surviving Hurricane Carmen. There's him investing in Apple Computer, and I think part of the Versus audience is something that is very contextual, which is your understanding of those historical events. Yeah. As we talked about with F for Fake and the Howard Hughes stuff, what was happening at at the time for the irony of what is going on with Forrest Gump to have any kind of resonance. And I think 25 years on, I'm like, there is no irony anymore. It kind of fades. And whatever satire that was meant to be in the novel is completely lost in the film. It is amusing if you understand the context, but the film doesn't tell you what the quote unquote the truth of the moment is. The film is lying to you about what happened.
Forrest Gump, John Lennon.
Welcome home.
You had quite a trip. Can you tell us what was China like?
In the land of China, people hardly got nothing at all.
No possessions?
And in China, they never go to church.
No religion, too?
Ah. Hard to imagine.
Well, it's easy if you try, Dick.
And I think unlike Soleil doesn't lie to you. I think this film does lie to you, but in an ironic way, but it doesn't tell you that it's lying. The other films reveal that they were, This film is trying to be ironic about history, but there's a point when you forget history that the film will become what it is, which is why I described it as a manga wet dream, because ultimately this story is... we'll get to that when we deal with Jenny.
I've got less issues with... I'm reading less subtext into it than I think you are. But what the observation I want to make in relation to Antagonists is it's very episodic. So each episode often has... It's got conflict for Forrest, and there's often a sequence level antagonist. In Vietnam, it's the war, it's the Viet Cong, it's the loss of his best friend. But as a broad overarching story, basically this is almost could be seen as the story told from the villain's point of view.
Yeah, I think Forrest is the antagonist to everyone else around him.
Exactly. He's got one goal, which is live with Jenny, but he has no control over that whatsoever. All the agency in his and Jenny's relationship is with Jenny. She decides when she can come and go. He even says at one point, why won't you marry me? It's like kind of almost the low point of the whole film is...
Will you marry me? I'd make a good husband, Jenny.
You would, Forrest.
But you won't marry me.
You don't want to marry me.
Why don't you love me, Jenny? I'm not a smart man, but I know what love is.
And so she comes and goes from his life. As you say, part of the joy of the film is just watching him, this very simple, very kind man, butt up against all these other characters, and him forcing them to change. He forces Jenny to change. He forces even his mother to change, to recognize him for the amazing person that he is. He forces Lieutenant Dan, obviously, to change.
No, okay. So let's go through it, because it's not obvious if you haven't seen the film. And at this point, this film there are probably listeners that were born after this film that came out. So let's
don't depress me, Stu.
So there's two kind of quote unquote forces of antagonism or conflicts or obstacles for Forrest Gump, but I don't even think they're really obstacles to him. So the one is his low IQ, but I don't think it's presented as an obstacle to him. The film certainly doesn't show it as being that much of an obstacle other than in the context of Jenny. The assumption I think that we make is that Jenny doesn't want to be with him because he's low IQ. The one that he begins with him is that he's got a curved spine and he's got leg braces, and that becomes an obstacle, and he's unable to walk properly. But due to that, when he meets Elvis ends up imitating the dance of Forrest that Forrest Gump makes when Elvis plays to him, and the sequence ends with him being bullied by his by these people, and then Jenny tells him to run. And he keeps on running, and we see the braces break off him. He overcomes the obstacle. And that's kind of it in terms of Forrest. Run, Forrest, runs. And then it becomes him getting into football, and through football,
I got to go to college too.
He gets involved with the kind of the desegregation. Oh yeah, and this has the moment. He's the one that followed through a girl drops one of the African American girls that's trying to go into the university when they're trying to desegregate, drops her folder, and Forrest picks it up, gives it to her, and goes in, and that kind of opens up other white students to do it. So he changes the school at that point. Then he goes to Vietnam, and yes, the obstacle for him is, but I don't think we're never afraid for him, because the whole film is framed with Forrest Gump sitting at a bus
park bench,
telling these stories to whoever's nearby. There are episodic stories because he's just telling the story about this time in his childhood when blah blah blah.
And he'll draw an end in any given episode by saying, and that's all I want to say about that.
I think he's absolutely the antagonist. He's an antagonist for Jenny. He's an antagonist for Dan. He's an antagonist for Bubba. So Bubba's a soldier he meets, and they want to go in shrimping. And it does set up some quests, but ultimately he's responsible for Dan changing, because he's Lieutenant Dan. The whole unit is nearly wiped out. Forrest saves Lieutenant Dan, and that comes back, and they become friends. Forrest ends up becoming a ping pong person, and he meets Richard Nixon, and that leads to Watergate, and so on and so forth. He is a force of change on the others. It's not that he's an obstacle. In a way, he is an obstacle to those people. He stops them getting what they want. Lieutenant Dan wanted to die in Vietnam, a war hero.
Now, you listen to me. We all have a destiny. Nothing just happens. It's all part of a plan. I should have died out there with my men, but now I'm nothing but a goddamn cripple.
And I think the Jenny thing is the more complicated aspect of it, but almost all those sequences are about Gump kind of being the shark. He is unchanging, and he's belligerent and stubborn because he doesn't know any better. He's a good person, and
he doesn't seem to make decisions. This isn't fair. I think he makes lots of decisions in the film, but it feels like there's no decision because he will always do the right thing in any given circumstance, because he's not smart enough to, ever want to do anyone else harm or mischief. And it feels like the one kind of decision he makes, he chooses to sign up, sort of, but again, that's he graduates from college and he gets a pamphlet for joining the army thrust into his hands, and then joins up.
The only thing that comes close to choices is any time that Jenny is in danger, he throws a punch.
Yeah, but again, that doesn't feel like a choice. He doesn't.
He's trying to white knight her.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like he would ever sit back and watch Jenny suffer, because he doesn't understand how complex the situations that she may want to be in those positions to a greater lesser extent.
And that's definitely the irony. When and this is playing point of view, but the opposite to Ocean's 8. We are ahead of Forrest on so much.
Yeah.
Right? And it's in conflict, but the conflict, instead of making us lean in, makes us amused or horrified. So when we learn that Jenny is, through context, that Jenny, all of it, the fact that Forrest's mum sleeps with the principal to get him into the school, when we learn that Jenny is being sexually abused by her father, and Forrest Gump just doesn't seem to process it.
Now, remember how I told you that Jenny never seemed to want to go home? Well, she lived in a house that was old as Alabama. Her mama had gone up to heaven when she was 5, and her daddy was some kind of a farmer.
Jenny?
He was a very loving man. He was always kissing and touching her and her sisters.
The naivety is amusing to us. And it's a conflict between us and the character. We're ahead of them at that point.
Yeah, I think you're making an excellent point.
And that's to do with the history. Like, all of it. I guess we're ahead of Forrest. Like, either we know that the history didn't play out quite like it showed, you know, particularly with the really bad CGI now, 20-something years later, 25 years later, you know, or it's because we understand what's actually happening. Like when Jenny describes what she eventually becomes ill with as a virus. I think it's apparently hepatitis C, but I always interpreted it as AIDS.
Yeah. Here's what I found astonishing about the film, looking at it through this lens, is there's no villain, there's no real goal for Forrest other than Jenny.
Which is, I think, underplays slightly how important that is a driver for him.
Yeah, but it's a driver for him, but it doesn't drive any of his decisions. Because he has no choice in the matter. You know, he joins up, he goes to college conveniently near Jenny, but that wasn't the driver of him going there. He goes to war not to win Jenny over or not. He doesn't play ping pong to win Jenny over or not. He doesn't drive a shrimp boat to win Jenny over or not. Like, they're not driving his actions or his decisions. He just wants her, and whenever she comes, he asks for her to stay, and she will either stay or go.
The shrimp boat is actually a great example of what it is. It's all luck. Like, it's all Deus Ex Machina. Like, this is the opposite of Pixar's coincidences to get characters into trouble. The Forrest Gump is about coincidences getting Forrest out of trouble, but we assume the coincidences happen from his naivety. So when there's a storm, he just naively buckets the shrimp boat into the storm. And as it turns out, that was a cyclone, and they're the only ship that's still around, and they suddenly own the shrimping business.
Yeah. What I wanted to say is the one decision it feels like he actually makes as a character that's really clearly him is when Jenny leaves him after the first time that they have sex, is he just starts running and ends up running for 3 years. And that is the only time where he's like, I'm running because I want to run. But there's no goal, there's no obstacle, and his running is suddenly inspiring all these other characters to do things and change the world around him.
He is the force of change, yeah.
To me, it's remarkable to have a story about such a memorable character. Like, there's still so many lines in the film that people it's so permeated popular culture, and yet it bucks so much of what is conventional screenwriting narrative about what a protagonist is supposed to be or supposed to do. That's what I find is astonishing about it.
Yeah, because I think in a way Jenny is kind of the protagonist.
Yeah.
She makes the final choice, which is to marry Forrest, is hers.
She proposes to him.
Well, he proposes to her, but we know the answer is going to be no. It's waiting. She's got the agency in the relationship, and we know he's going to say yes.
I'm sick.
What, do you have a cough due to cold?
I have some kind of virus, and the doctors don't know what it is, and there isn't anything they can do about it.
You could come home with me. Jenny, you and little Forrest could come stay at my house in Greenbow. I'll take care of you if you're sick.
Would you marry me, Forrest?
Okay.
Yeah, he had proposed to her at the low point of the film where she leaves him, but when she comes back to him and she's had her son, it's 4 years later or something, and at that point she proposes to him. So he's got no agency, no goals, no overarching goal, no want or need other than Jenny, about which he has zero control. And I think if anyone ever says this is how you write the story, you just point to Forrest Gump and say that is not how that film works.
Yeah, so there's a few observations to make that connects it to, like all the other films, it's got voiceover. It's got voiceover from the perspective of Forrest, and he's speaking to the person in the context of the film next to them, but because he's addressing them and they're not characters, they're just surrogates, that he's really speaking to us.
Yes.
And the conflict, as I said, is between point of view about his naivety and us. And that it kind of makes us feel kind of like concerned, like he's like a lost puppy dog. Like emotionally, we feel kind of like he's a bit childlike or whatever. So our relationship with him is one of concern, but not suspense concern, but kind of like a, yeah.
Well, like you said, the structure of the film takes out any suspense because we know he lives through whatever he's telling us.
You know, and then I think it's to see how, as we said, there's like scene-based obstacles for him as much as we describe him as kind of Jaws, but he's got no overall. I mean, he's never in jeopardy. There's no stakes, but there is a enjoyment to see how he changes people and how his naivety kind of creates moments of amusement. Like it is something a little bit different, you know. And his naivety about Vietnam, like all his dialogue, that's a tension between what he's saying and what we as an audience understand of the real situation. We'll see how this film plays in 100 years, you know, because it relies so heavily on that. But it's also got Jenny's journey is still a journey. The film has chosen not to focus on it. It's like Sicario. And it's the reason I call it
and
like
Lieutenant Dan's journey is a big journey as well.
Yeah, so the journey of those characters, like Lieutenant Dan loses his legs in Vietnam and then ultimately comes to be thankful for Forrest Gump saving his life. At the beginning, he is not.
Forrest, I never thanked you for saving my life.
And Jenny her journey and relationship with him is a bit odd. And that's why it feels thematic. Because her story is like, you know, this is set against the backdrop of the counterculture, and she literally just goes through all the cliches of a girl falling in with the wrong cloud. She starts off as a nice girl from the set. Well, not a nice girl. She's sexually abused, but then she gets involved in hippies and Black Panther and drugs, and she's a stripper, and she ends up getting AIDS, and the only person that can save her is the propertied landowner from Alabama that will save her and accept her to look after him because she can't look after herself. Like, it's such a politically weird film 25 years later. You're like, ugh.
That is certainly a read that has been impacted by the times, I feel.
But I think how else can you interpret it? It's like we don't have access to Jenny. Yeah. So we don't see why she's behaving this way. And the one time that Forrest, I mean, talking about conflict with the audience, the one time Forrest actually has the opportunity to speak about how he actually genuinely feels about war, right? He's him in front of this whole crowd near the monument in Washington, WC, you know, Washington, DC, and they ask him what his experience of Vietnam are like, and then it cuts to another character pulling out this, obviously someone of the army, pulling out all the cables, and we can't hear what Forrest has to say.
There's only one thing I can say about the war in Vietnam. In Vietnam,
That's it.
That's all I have to say about that.
And we never know about whether he is like, it was horrible watching all my friends die. We should never have been there, right? Or whatever the context is. So it's the film being actively hostile to the audience and having an obstruction in front of our goal of understanding what is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your read is a perfectly valid read, but I think you could also see it as a story about how simpleness and kindness are the virtues to get behind. If you look at it as a very, very simple morality tale.
Yeah.
He's so slow that he doesn't see race.
Yes, I know what it's kind of, yeah, he's colorblind, but then that raises a whole bunch of other issues that 25 years later are more complex. Yes, I think there is a fairy tale that you can see it as morality tale, but I think that's conservatism. I mean, I don't want to turn this into common sense. I like to call it sleeping in with Stu Willis. That's going to be my version of the Sam Harris podcast. I'm so woke, I'm still asleep. That's which is meant to be ironic, everyone. I don't particularly feel very euphoric. So I know I'm kind of mumbling at this point, which is probably a good sign for us to wrap up. But I think Forrest Gump's interesting to revisit because it does do sequence-level antagonism. The voiceover and the relationship of the film with the audience kind of unifies it.
Well, I thought it was a very lovely story. And you tell it so well, with such enthusiasm.
So I think it's probably a good opportunity to wrap up. And I'm just going to suggest that we kind of return to Jack's question. Man, he got good value out of that fucking question. That kind of kicked off this epic 10-hour... I hope you're satisfied, Jack.
I was wondering if you've considered taking a closer look at films where the world of the story acts as the antagonistic force as opposed to a traditional villain. I'm looking for examples outside of, say, disaster films without a singular or even human antagonist. How do these films keep the story from feeling like a series of vignettes strung together? Or to put it another way, a series of and-thens instead of but-therefores? Is the protagonist having a clearly defined goal enough to carry a film with a changing cast of antagonists that serve as temporary obstacles? And can you think of other films that have really pulled this off? And of course, what makes it work? Thanks, guys.
So how do you write a film without an antagonist?
A singular antagonist.
Yeah.
And I think, broadly speaking, what we're kind of talking about and what I said at the beginning, that there is obviously scene-level antagonists, not obviously, but there can be scene-level antagonists, sequence-level, act-level, whole film level. I think what he's talking about for me is that the source of the antagonizing or the, actively hostile force, or as much as I like talking about active hostility as a thing it does, I think antagonist is a good name for it. Sorry, Matt. Actively hostile is what it does. Antagonism or antagonistic force is a way of describing it. I think they're the organizing principle behind those forces. And obviously some of our scene level forces are going to be physical obstacles, even in a film that is versus self, or is versus audience. Yeah. But I think ultimately it relates to kind of the dramatic, each of those questions, which I talked about at the very beginning, relates to the central dramatic questions that you're dealing with in that particular scene or sequence or act or film, and the kind of questions you're asking. And in the case of versus audience, we're asking questions often about theme, which is what we're going to be talking about in thematic sequences. Why am I watching this? What is the meaning behind this? And the meaning may not be a thematic meaning. It can be, what does this say about the character? But the questions are not framed as character questions, where versus self films, I think the central conflicts are about the character's self-recognition. And I think what's interesting about versus nature in hindsight is that versus nature will either fall into versus self, or it will fall into versus, those questions will be versus self or versus human, or maybe even versus system. I think versus nature is a way of dramatizing those sources of conflict.
I mean, the main takeaway I had from versus nature being distinct from the other ones was the non-negotiating with the antagonistic forces changes the tactics of the protagonist and how defeatable it is and where you want to take your protagonist.
Well, you can't negotiate with F is for fake either.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of where I've come to the conclusion. I think you're going to have those forces in there to maintain interest, and I think they're ultimately related to the kind of questions that you're asking of your characters and your audience. And they shift over the course of the film. I think that's what's interesting about Forrest Gump, is that it does vary. Those questions vary from sequence to sequence.
And, look, I think with this episode, we put a lot of our learnings up front, so I don't necessarily feel compelled to put so many learnings at this point, but I have loved what this has done for my own craft and writing, like this 5-part exploration into antagonists. I feel so much more empowered having done the work now, and I'm really excited about where we're thinking of going in terms of diving into character decisions, character motivations, character journeys, And yeah, I hope our listeners appreciated it as well.
I'm going to maybe have the last word.
Yeah,
See.
fire away.
You might want to intercept. We talked about at the end of Versus Systems that there, and even in this episode, about characters having the choice to escape or succumb or overthrow to the system. But I think that is true whether it's versus human. Often versus human stories, they overthrew them. What's his face? John McClane overthrows Hans Gruber. But I think it's also true of versus self. If your conflict is internal, do you escape it? Do you overthrow it? Or do you succumb to it? And then I think that's obviously true of systems. Nature as well. I mean, I guess you're quite like with Supernatural, with the woman in black or the witch. In The Witch, the question is, do they escape Black Phillip? Do they overcome him, or do they escape him? You may ask, what's that? How does that work with versus audience films? And I'm going to end with, and it's an example from a video game, but I think it shows what the medium is. All mediums are capable of. And I've talked about this before, I think, on our theme episode, which is the video game Spec Ops: The Line had a level where you, as the player character, have, it's not even an option. You find some white phosphorus and have to use it on civilians to continue progressing the level, right? And I remember when I got there, I'm like, I don't want to do this. The game has done a very great job of you walk through a level where people have been killed by white phosphorus, which is like napalm turned up to 11 in only the way that the military industrial complex knows how. Like, it is horrifying. So you know the damage it does. And then you're presented with this. And there's no way to get around it. You have to use it. And then to the point where I thought about quitting the game. But I did it and continued and was horrified by what I had done, but continued. This game, which sets up the next episode, because it's inspired by Apocalypse Now. This game is more or less Apocalypse Now as a game. The developers were like, yeah, you actually had an option. You could have quit. We deliberately didn't give you an option to get around it, because this is an example of why these things happen in the real world, that people believe they have a mission, that they have to achieve the goal, which is to finish, in this case, the game. And so they're prepared to do horrible things. And that's what our comment is. And so that's a game where the game is so actively hostile to the audience that you had the option of escaping. You couldn't overthrow it. You couldn't negotiate with a video game, but you either succumbed to it or you escaped it. But I didn't escape it. And I thought it ends up being, I'm talking about it like nearly 8 years later of having to play it, because it's such a profoundly emotional moment. And it's quite awesome. And I think when these films do that correctly, they can have moments like that. But that's kind of my learning now in terms of antagonism. Do you escape, overcome, or succumb? I think it's more complicated than educated or thwarted. Now it's your turn to escape. If you hadn't escaped earlier.
Well, look, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank our patrons once again, in particular, Murab Musings, Paul, Sandra, Rob, Chris, Joachim, and Krob. You guys, hope you enjoyed your 10 hours of antagonism, and we'll be back relatively soon, we hope, because we've already got it in the can, with our latest episode with Stephen Cleary on thematic sequences.
And if you want to get it early before it's released, sign up to Patreon.
I hope you all feel like arguing with either Stu or myself
about anything on this episode or anything in general.
And you can find many ways of getting in touch with us at our website at draft-0.com.
At the website, you'll also find the show notes for this and all our other episodes,
as well as links to support us and spread the word for free via a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Very important for spreading the word.
Or if you think that what we do here is worth $1 or preferably more than $1, then you can also find links to our Patreon page to support us getting these episodes to you quicker. Thanks.
And thanks for listening.
We've met before, haven't we? I don't think so. Where was it you think we met? At your house, don't you remember? No, I don't. Are you sure? Of course. As a matter of fact, I'm there right now.
What do you mean you're where right now?
At your house.
That's fucking crazy, man.
Call me. Dial your number. Go ahead. I told you I was here.
How'd you do that?
Ask me.
How'd you get inside my house?
You invited me. It is not my custom to go where I'm not wanted.
Who are you?
Give me back my phone. It's been a pleasure talking to you.